as it appears from the T'ang Dynasty. The T'ang Dynasty started in about 600 AD and went to about 900 AD. The oldest European version of this story was found to be an Italian story from 1632 AD. Therefore, the Yeh Shen story predates that tale you know as Cinderella. Cinderella seems to have made her way into Europe from Asia. In the dim past, even before the Qing and the Han dynasties, there lived a cave chief of southern China by the name of Wu. As was the custom in those days, Chief Wu had taken 2 wives. Each wife in her turn had presented Wu with a baby daughter. But when one of the wives sickened and died, not too many days after that, Chief Wu took to his bed and died too. Yeh Shen, the little orphan, grew into girlhood in her stepmother's home. She was a bright child and lovely too, with skin as smooth as ivory and dark pools for eyes. Her stepmother was jealous of all this beauty and goodness, for her own daughter was not very pretty at all. So in her displeasure, she gave poor Yeh Shen the heaviest and the most unpleasant chores. The only friend that Yeh Shen had to her name was a fish that she caught and she raised. It was a beautiful fish with golden eyes, and every day it would come out of the water and rest its head on the bank of the pond, waiting for Yeh Shen to feed it. Stepmother gave Shen little enough food for herself, but the orphan child always found something to share with her fish, which grew to an enormous size. Somehow, the stepmother heard of this. She was terribly angry to discover that Yeh Shen had kept a secret from her. She hurried down to the pond, but she was unable to see the fish, for Yeh Shen's pet hid itself very wisely. The stepmother, however, was a crafty woman. She soon thought of a plan. She walked home and called out, "Yeh Shen, go and collect firewood, but wait! The neighbors might see you. Leave your filthy coat here." The minute the girl was out of sight, her stepmother slipped on the coat herself and went down again to the pond. This time, the big fish saw Yeh Shen's familiar jacket and heaved itself onto the bank, expecting to be fed. But the stepmother, having hidden a dagger in her sleeve, stabbed the fish, wrapped it in her garments, and took it home for dinner. When Yeh Shen came to the pond that evening, she found her pet had disappeared. Overcome with grief, the girl collapsed on the ground and dropped her tears into the still waters of the pond. "Ah, poor child," a voice had said. Yeh Shen sat up to find a very old man looking at her. He wore the coarsest of clothes, and his hair flowed down over his shoulders. "Kind uncle, who may you be?" Yeh Shen asked. "That's not important, my child. All you must know is that I have been sent to tell you of the wondrous powers of your fish." "My fish? But sir," the girl's eyes filled with tears, and she could not go on. The old man sighed and said, "Yes, my child, your fish is no longer alive, but I must tell you that your stepmother is once again the cause of your sorrows." Yeh Shen gasped in horror, but the old man went on. "Let us not dwell on things that are past," he said, "for I have come bringing you a gift. Now you must listen carefully to this. The bones of your fish are filled with a powerful spirit. Whenever you are in serious need, you must kneel before them and let them know your heart's desires. But do not waste their gifts." Yeh Shen wanted to ask the old sage many more questions, but he rose to the sky before she could utter another word. With a heavy heart, Yeh Shen made her way to the trash heap to gather up the remains of her friend. Time went by, and Yeh Shen, who was often left alone, took comfort in speaking to the bones of her fish. When she was hungry, which happened quite often, Yeh Shen asked the bones for food. In this way, Yeh Shen managed to live from day to day, but she lived in dread that her stepmother would discover her secret and even take that away from her. So the time passed in the springtime. Festival time was approaching. It was the busiest time of the year. Such cooking and cleaning and sewing was to be done. Yeh Shen hardly had a moment's rest. At the spring festival, the young men and the women came from the village and hoped to meet and choose who they would marry. How Yeh Shen longed to go. But her stepmother had other plans. She hoped to find a husband for her own daughter and did not want anyone to see how beautiful Yeh Shen was first. When finally the holiday arrived, the stepmother and her daughter dressed themselves in their finery and filled their baskets with sweetmeats. "You must remain at home now and watch to see that no one steals fruit from our trees," her stepmother told Yeh Shen. and then she departed for the banquet with her own daughter. As soon as she was alone, Yeh Shen went to speak to the bones of her fish. "Oh, dear friend," she said, kneeling before the precious bones, "I long to go to the festival, but I cannot show myself in these rags. Is there somewhere I could borrow clothes to fit and wear to the feast?" At once she found herself in a gown of deep blue, with a cloak of kingfisher feathers draped over her shoulders. And best of all, on her tiny feet were the most beautiful slippers she had ever seen. They were woven of golden threads, in a pattern like the scales of a fish, and the glistening soles were made of solid gold. And there was magic in the shoes, for they should have been quite heavy, but when Yeh Shen walked, her feet felt light as the air. "Be sure you do not lose your golden shoes," said the spirit of the bones. Yeh Shen promised to be careful. Delighted with her transformation, she bid a fond farewell to the bones of her fish and slipped off to join in the merrymaking. That day, Yeh Shen turned as many heads as she appeared at the feast. All the people around her whispered, "Look at that beautiful girl." But above this, stepsister was heard to say, "Mother, does she resemble our Yeh Shen?" Upon hearing this, Yeh Shen jumped up and ran off before her stepsisters could look closely at her. She raced down the mountainside, and in doing so, she lost one of her golden slippers. No sooner had the shoe fallen off from her foot than all her fine clothes turned back into rags. Only one thing remained: the tiny golden shoe. Yeh Shen hurried to the bones of her fish and returned the slipper, promising to find its mate. But now the bones were silent. Sadly, Yeh Shen realized that she had lost her only friend. She hid the little shoe in her bed straw, and she went outside to cry. Leaning against the fruit tree, she sobbed and sobbed until she fell asleep. The stepmother left the gathering to check on Yeh Shen, but when she returned home, she found the girl sound asleep with her arms wrapped around a fruit tree. So thinking no more of her, the stepmother rejoined the party. Meanwhile, a villager had found the shoe, and recognizing its worth, he sold it to a merchant, who presented it to the king of the island kingdom of T'ang. The king was more than happy to accept the slipper as a gift. He was entranced by the shiny thing, which was shaped of the most precious metals, yet made no sound when touched to stone. The more he marveled at its beauty, the more determined he became to find the woman to whom the shoe belonged. A search was begun in the ladies of his own kingdom, but all who tried the sandal found it impossibly small. Undaunted, the king ordered the search widened to include the cave women from the countryside where the slipper had been found. Since he realized it would take many years for every woman to come to the island to test her foot in the slipper, the king thought of a way to get the right woman to come forward. He ordered the sandal placed in a pavilion by the side of the road where it had been found, and his herald announced that the shoe would be returned to its original owner. Then, from a nearby hiding place, the king and his men settled to watch and wait for a woman with tiny feet to come claim her slipper. All day at the pavilion was crowded with cave women who had come to test the foot in the shoe. Yeh Shen's stepmother and stepsister were among them, but not Yeh Shen. They told her to stay home. By the day's end, although many women had eagerly tried to put on the slipper, it still had not been worn. Wearily, the king continued his vigil into the night. It wasn't until the blackest part of the night, when the moon hid behind a cloud, that Yeh Shen dared to show her face at the pavilion, and even then, she tiptoed across the wide floor. Sinking down to her knees, the girl in rags examined the tiny shoe. Only when she was sure that this was the missing mate to her golden slipper did she dare pick it up. At last, she returned both little shoes to the fish bones. Surely, then, her beloved spirit would speak to her again. Now, the king's first thought on seeing Yeh Shen take the precious slipper was to throw the girl into prison as a thief. But when she turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of her face. At once, the king was struck by the sweet harmony of her features, which seemed to be so out of keeping with the rags she wore. It was then that he took a closer look and noticed that she walked upon the tiniest feet he had ever seen. With a wave of his hand, the king signaled that this tattered creature was to be allowed to depart with the golden slipper. And quietly, the king's men slipped off, and they followed her home. All this time, Yeh Shen was unaware of all the excitement she had caused. She had made her way home and was about to hide both sandals in her bedding when there was a pounding at her door. Yeh Shen went to see who it was and found a king at her doorstep. She was very frightened at first, but the king spoke to her in a kind voice and asked her to try the golden slippers on her feet. The maiden did as she was told, and as she stood in the golden slippers, her rags were transformed once more into a feathered coat and a beautiful blue gown. Her loveliness made it seem like she was a heavenly being, and the king suddenly knew in his heart that he had found his true love. Not long after this, Yeh Shen was married to the king. But fate was not so gentle with her stepmother and her stepsister. Since they had been unkind to his beloved, the king would not permit Yeh Shen to bring him to his palace. They remained in their cave home, where one day, it is said, they were crushed to death in a shower of flying stones. And a small, tiny marker was the only thing to know that they ever existed.